We're going to begin with some of the things some of this approach that I'm going to present to you today is going to be a little familiar because I have explained to you through several of our series how stories work. We did the whole book of Mark that way, the Gospel of Mark that way. But I have been writing my master's thesis on precisely this subject. You've seen the story of David and Saul. When David is anointed by Samuel and then is presented to Saul, I've taken that little story to write my master's thesis and go deeper into how does the Bible really tell stories. And of course, all of the Torah, the majority of the Torah in general, overall, is actually a story. We do have some genealogies, we do have some instructions when we get to Leviticus, and we have some poetry along the way, sprinkled here and there. But overall, we're talking about a story. And not only individual stories, not only bigger books like Genesis, but the entire Torah is a story. And eventually where I want to land in my doctoral work. And, when I begin this fall, I begin my PhD program, but I already know where I want to go with the dissertation. I don't know, it's going to be 250 pages or something crazy like that. But I want to write about the plot of the Torah. Every story has a plot. It has a climax, right, where the two guys, they hash it out and they fight. But this climax began somewhere, so we back up to the introduction, the setting, where we are told who the players are, what is the time frame, and what is the location, where are we at, and when. And then from there, from the setting, we have the beginning of the tension, with the beginning of the problem, until it goes into the climax and everything explodes. We're going to drive it down to the conclusion, but before we get to the conclusion, there's another step that I call the consequence. So I'm, in my thesis, I'm proposing 5 steps. You got to do that. You got to try to speak the fancy language. So I propose that, we have context, we have conflict, climax, consequence, and conclusion. And those 5 elements, however they're called, and many people call them different ways, but I'm trying to make it memorable for people. So here's the 5 C's. I don't often do that because I'm not a preacher. But I thought this time around, hey, I think that would be a good idea. Those 5 elements, however we call them, they are always present in any kind of story, whether it is a novel you're writing or a movie you're watching and anything in between. These components are going to be there. And good writers know how to seam everything so that it flows and you don't even know what the writer is doing to you unless you've studied this stuff, and then you're like, I know what they did there. But we're going to approach Genesis 1 that way. Amazing. And let me tell you that one of the controversies about Genesis 1, when you begin to talk about it in these terms, in literary terms, one of the controversies is whether Genesis 1 is poetry or prose or story. Because it has a lot of poetic stuff. It has a lot of repetition and cycles. Day 1, and there was evening, there was morning. Day 2, there was evening and morning. So you can see how it is a beautiful work of art. And for many people, they feel like, no, this is actually poetry. And I don't blame them for thinking that way. However, I do think their approach is flawed for the simple reason that when you tell stories in Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, when you tell stories, you follow a specific kind of verb. That your main verb is going to be a specific kind of verb. And when you see these verbs lining up, one after the other, there's no room for you to, it is objective. There's no room for opinion. I think it's that. No, I see it that. No. If it has this particular kind of verb as the main verb running through the story, then it is a story. Even if you build a lot of artistry in it, you're still telling a story. We're going to call this verb, and I'm going to show you in a moment, we're going to call this verb the vav consecutive. There are like 5 different ways to call it, and I try to find the one that was the least nerdy for you. A vav consecutive. I don't know. Whenever you read, even in the English Bible, the Hebrew uses the word "and" a lot. And God said, and Moses said, and he said, and he took, and he offered, and he sacrificed, and he went, and always that way. And your English Bibles, they're like, this is bad English. So they try to say, now Abraham, but the Hebrew says, and Abraham. Or they would say, but Abraham, but the Hebrew says, and Abraham. So for the Hebrews, like, everything is and. And I understand the English translators. They're trying to keep you awake when you're reading, like, let me change it up a little bit here so that, But that's why you want to go back to the Hebrew and read it and catch, the that's actually there. So this particular kind of verb uses that construction. The and Abraham did, and God said, and Moses spoke, and So we call that the and. It's called the vav. And so we say the vav consecutive because you have the vav and the verb. So the verb comes after the vav. So it's consecutive, it's after. So this type of verb is always the verb for storytelling. It's always. And so we have things, in Genesis. So for instance, we begin reading Genesis 1:3, right, verse 3. It says, just to give you an example of this type of verb, it says, then God said. That's one of the ways to avoid the end. Then. So then God said, and there was light. Verse 4, God saw. It should be, and God saw. And God separated the light. Verse 5, and God called the light. And there was evening, and there was morning. All of these are vav consecutive verbs. We are in the presence of a story. That's the first thing we need to determine. It's not poetry. It is artistic, but it's a story. So we are in a story. That's the first thing we need to figure out. Once we know we are in a story, we know that the first thing we're going to encounter has to be the setting. It has to be the setting. And at some point, the action begins. But the action begins with a vav consecutive verb. And the first vav consecutive verb that you find is in verse 3. And God said. And God said, let there be light. That's the first action. Now you say, but you do have action before that. It says in Genesis 1:1 that in the beginning God created. That's an act. That's action. What do you mean? Well, guess what? That verb in verse 1 is not a vav consecutive. The story has not begun yet. It is the setting. And let me show you a little bit of what we're talking about here. So verse 1, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Notice the first phrase, in the beginning. time. And then it says, God created the heavens and the earth. Place. This is the introduction. This is the setting of the story. This is the context. This is where we set up the when, who, and where. Now, Genesis is divided into, or organized, let me put it that way, it's organized into 11 different episodes. 11 different episodes. And they all have, we know this because they all have a specific introduction. You know, the story comes to an end, and then there's this introduction over and over and over. 10 times we have this introduction. And it is, it's driven by the word toldot. And in English, it comes out as, these are the generations of, right? You've read Genesis many times, and you always read this phrase. And these are the generations of so-and-so. Generations of Noah, generations of Adam. These are the generations of Isaac, Ishmael, 10 of those. So we have 10 of those beginning in chapter 2 when it says, this is what became of heaven and earth. It's the same Hebrew phrase, although you have to translate it a little different because you can't say the generations of heaven and earth because it's not a person, right? So you have 10 of those. And the 11th one is actually Genesis 1. So Genesis 1 does not begin with, this is what became of. But it does have an introduction, which is verse 1. In the beginning, God created heavens and earth. So that's the episode first, really, which makes up the 11. So the 10 that are introduced by, these are the generations of, and chapter 1 is number 11, which is God created, in the beginning God created heavens and earth. Does that make sense a little bit? Okay. Let me tell you what we're doing here. I am trying to turn this time in which we open the Word in the middle of our service, and I want to make this a world-class time. I want to make this a high-quality time in the Word. Now, unfortunately for you, this means I'm going to make you think. I'm going to make you work. We're going to get into the Word. Now, you know me. You know that I like to go deep. And you know that I always bring you a steak, no milk, and definitely nothing frozen. No frozen meat. We're gonna make this stuff from scratch, right? But that requires you to work. You know, unless you're Mark Davis and you fall asleep, which is okay. You know, it's fine. I understand that. I get it. But so I am changing, in other words, I am changing. Right before your eyes, I'm changing. And I'm telling you, if you thought I went deep, we're going deeper now. So I'm turning this time in the Word into a world-class time in the Word. We're going deeper. But I need you to come with me. I need you to put on your thinking hats, your hard hats, and come to work here in the Word. And I'm cutting it and I'm chopping it from scratch and everything. But I bring you along slowly so that I don't want to lose you. I don't want to make it boring for you. So hopefully I'm doing that. So in Genesis 1:1, we have the introduction. We have a summary, an introductory summary. It gives you a summary for the rest of the episode, which is going to be chapter 1, bleeding into chapter 2, verse 3. It gives you a glimpse of the content of the passage. It is an introductory summary. It summarizes, but it you into the theme. And it does it in a beautiful way because it presents us the time frame and then the action and the one who is acting here, God himself. And it focuses on him. The way he is introduced here, it focuses on him. And it gives us this phrase, this introductory phrase. In the beginning, God created heavens and earth. And he's going to complement it in 3 different ways. You always want to do this. You always want to say, here's what I'm talking about, and here's what I'm saying about what I'm talking about. So this is the topic, and now let me tell you what I'm going to say about the topic. I'm going to say 3 things about this topic. If only guys could communicate that way with their wives. You know, the wives are like, yeah. But guess what? It works the other way around too. You know, sometimes Michelle and I are talking, and I'm like, okay, what was that again? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't tell you that I switched. You know, it's now, and so, but you know, I do the same. So here are the 3 things. We have the topic, God created heavens and earth, and now the text is going to give us 3 things to complement this introduction. And it says in verse 2, the earth was formless and void. Typically in Hebrew, you have the verb first and then the person who did the action. You know, when we read, and God said, you know, in English, we put the person first and then the verb. Hebrew is the opposite. So Hebrew will say, and said God, let there be light. That's the typical order, especially for storytelling. When you switch the order and you put the person first, that's an attention getter. Like, whoa, what are you doing here? The reason it does that is to tell you I'm switching themes. I put it in the front to tell you the topic, to tell you what we're talking about. And we call it that. We call it fronting. So you front the person or the object that you're talking about. So in this case, the earth is fronted because we say the earth was formless and void. So it's telling you, this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the earth. So you got to move fast with this. It begins with God, the time and the place, and then it switches on you. It tells you, I'm talking about the earth. Why do you think it will talk about the earth? Well, here's the people of Israel. They are reading this for the very first time. Where are they coming from? And where are they going? The land. Guess what we call the land in Hebrew? Aretz. That's the phrase, that's the word that is used here. Aretz. God created the heavens and haaretz, the land of Israel. Genesis 1, it's talking about the land of Israel. Now you may say, wait, but this is talking about the creation of the whole world. What do you mean it's talking about Israel? Well, it's, like I always use this example. When your kids want to borrow the car, what do they ask for? They ask for the keys. Now, do you think they mean just the keys? You can just give them the keys, but you can't touch the car? Of course not. We know what they mean, right? Because this is a figure of speech in the English language and actually in Hebrew as well, that we call the totality of the thing by one of its parts, one of its characteristic parts. So the key speaks for the whole car, or the wheels. Borrow the wheels. Yeah, you know what they mean. They want to borrow the whole thing. So Hebrew does that as well. When it talks about the land, Eretz, this is the one part of the earth that characterizes the whole earth. So actually, it is talking about both. So it isn't wrong to say this is talking about the creation of the whole world, but it is talking about the whole world by talking about the land of Israel. And this is important because it's written to Israel as they are about to enter into the land. So God is speaking about this land that he created. We're going to see in Genesis 2 how the garden is pretty much like the temple. It's Jerusalem with God's presence in it and the tree of life, the temple itself. And then we corroborate the entire thing when we read Revelation 21 and 22. Then we know, yeah, Genesis 1 and 2 are talking about the same thing as Revelation 21 and 22. New creation, old creation. The tree of life, the river coming out of the garden, the whole thing. This is the new Jerusalem here, and this is the old Jerusalem in Genesis 1. Pretty cool, pretty cool. So he's giving us this introduction, this setting to the story, and he says, I'm talking about the land. But there's a problem here. The land is formless and void. Formless and void. He's going to address this problem, so we'll talk about this problem in a little bit, in a moment. The second thing he says, or the second issue he addresses, is the darkness. This is another phrase that is fronted, it's put before the verb, so he's talking about this. He says, darkness was over the surface of the deep. The darkness was over the surface of the deep. That's a problem. We're going to have to face this problem of darkness. And then the third one, now is a person. It says that the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. So the Spirit of God, I'm going to liken it to, I'm going to use a baseball illustration. Yeah? The Spirit of God is the hitter, the batter. He's sitting there, he's just waiting for the ball to be thrown. He's moving, he's waiting, he's ready. That's the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God is hovering so that when God gives the command, God gives the word is Yeshua, and the one who executes it is the Holy Spirit. So he's ready to create everything as soon as God gives the word. So this is the setting. We have the Spirit ready to address the problems that we've seen here. Everything is covered with water and darkness. It has no form, and it is empty. Huge problem. This is a God-sized problem. This is the setting of our story. Part of the argument for people to say that Genesis 1 is poetry and not story is because they say there's no conflict here. God is the only one acting. Towards the end of the story, he creates Adam. Adam is not opposing him. He's pretty, passive in the story. Adam doesn't do anything. He just receives the blessing and receives what God gives. God is the only one acting here. There's no enemy coming against him or opposing him. But that's lack of insight into the story. Because God is fighting these elements. We have a battle with sin. But does that mean that sin is a person? No. Sin is a principle, a force. But we fight sin very much every day. Well, God is fighting darkness, the deep, the abyss. He's fighting this formlessness and this emptiness. They're no match for him. He's taking on creation in this way to teach us how he works, how he takes care of these things when they come against us. We face darkness. We face emptiness. We face formlessness. And he wants Israel to learn, I know how to take care of these things. I'm the one that's going to do it for you. Watch, learn. This whole chapter is a lesson on how God works, how the Exodus works. We were talking about the Exodus earlier. I'm going to show you the Exodus in a little moment. Here in Genesis 1. And this is the whole setting. Just verses 1 and 2. The setting to our story. In verse 3, we have the first action. We already alluded to this. How do we know? It's the first Vav consecutive. So it's the very first act in this story. When you have the first action of a story, usually means this is what is called the inciting incident. The inciting incident. In other words, you're picking a fight. You know, your main character does something that is going to bring the battle to him. That's what we see here. The first thing that God does to speak and to create the light, it brings on the battle. And from then on, it's going to the tension is going to increase and increase and increase until we get to the climax. And we're going to see that next week because the climax comes in day 6. So we'll see the pattern of days 1, 2, and 3 today. And then next week we'll see days 4, 5, and 6. So in verse 3, day 1, we see then this first action that begins the confrontation, the conflict, the problem. And so God says, let there be light. And there was light. There is command and execution. Command and execution. He speaks and it happens. There's no delay. There's obedience. And then comes an evaluation. It comes an evaluation when he says, God saw that the light was good. God saw that the light was good. We have command, execution, and now evaluation. And then we have separation. Verse 4 continues saying, and God separated the light from the darkness. And then we have naming. Command, execution, evaluation, separation, naming. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Then we come to the end of the day, and we have this phrase that's repeated, right? There was evening and there was morning. There was evening, there was morning. The type of verb that is used here is plus the temporal reference, the day. That's a reference to time, right? Day 1, day 2, day 3, and so on. The verb, the vayehi plus time equals a pause, a break in the action. You've completed a cycle. There's a break here. And we know this because it's the end of day 1. And every day is going to have the same kind of break. It's always going to have this type of verb, vayehi plus time. And that, to us, it means we have a break. We have a break in the story. And we're going to have 6 of these breaks, of course, for the 6 days, this cycle of creation. So we have the command, the execution, the evaluation, the separation, the naming, and then the break. And we're ready. We're done with day 1. We're ready for day 2. So we tackle day 2 in verse 6. And I want to share this with you. One of the things that I discovered in my thesis, you need to come up with new stuff. You need to show that you've studied enough and you've observed things, and you're becoming an expert in this field, and you can observe new things and propose things that others haven't seen, or at least bring things together from different fields and bring them together and show how these things can work to solve problems in the interpretation of text. And when I was studying this section here, I came across a way to analyze quotations. When the Bible is full of quotations, and God said, fill in the blank, and Moses said, fill in the blank. This is over and over and over, all over Scripture, dialogue, people talking to each other, God speaking to his people, right? And so when you introduce these dialogues, these moments of different actors speaking to each other, the Hebrew uses different types of quotation formulas. It's a quotation formula, it's an introduction to the dialogue. In other words, as simple as, and God said, and Moses said to Israel, or God said to Moses, speak to the sons of Israel. Things like these are introductions to the dialogue, but they have great meaning. I was amazed. It was a great blessing for me. And let me share with you what's going on here in this introduction. So we already saw it in verse 3. We see it now in verse 6. And God said, and God said. And we're going to see it. We know we're going to see it all throughout chapter 1. And God said. Whenever you have this introductory quote, where it names one person but it doesn't name the other, usually we see, and God spoke to Moses, that's both are named, that has one meaning. Or, and God spoke to him, that has a different meaning. But here it is, and God spoke, period. When it appears like this, like in Genesis 1, and God said, it means 3 things. It means, number 1, that what is about to be said, it's centered on the speaker, meaning God is sovereign. This is a sovereign pronouncement. It is centered on the speaker. It is focused on God. We know this from the passage, but it's good to have the quotation itself corroborating that. It also means an emotional surge. That's interesting. An emotional surge. The phrase originally is an emotional burst or an emotional outburst. And I was, outburst doesn't really mean a good thing. When you have an emotional outburst, it's never a good thing. So I kind of changed it a little bit to an emotional surge. You can take that in a negative way or in a positive way. I want you to picture this, okay? I want to try to paint this for you. Let's say in verse 3, and God said, let there be light. I want you to picture all the angels around God when he made this pronouncement. They are seeing the light come alive for the first time ever. They've never seen light. And it comes and it is illuminating this bowl, this ball that God is creating, this that's full, that's surrounded with water and full of darkness, And then all of a sudden they can see it. I think there was a collective, and then a collective, wow. And then I think everybody went to their knees to worship him. You see, I don't think this was a boring pronouncement the way I read it. And God said, let there be light. I don't think it was that way. I think this was very emotional. I think this was, let there be light. Whoa. Wow. And they all hit the floor, and worship starts. You think this was emotionally charged? You bet your boots. Whenever we have this introduction to the quote, and God said, it is charged with an emotional surge. It is an awesome statement. And then, I told you there were 3 implications on this quotation formula. Right? The first one is centered on the speaker. It is focused on God, and God said. It is then emotionally, it has an emotional surge. But then it also has a sense of finality. Has a sense of finality to it. And God said. And when he pronounced the creation of light was the beginning of the end of darkness. Now, here's the thing. We still have darkness around. We still have night, even in that day. And there was evening and there was morning. And there was evening and there was morning. And there was evening and ever since then, we have evening and morning. But guess what? When you get to Revelation 21 and 22, you know what it says? There will be no night. There wouldn't even be a sun. He is the light. And there will be no night, no darkness. So, from the moment that he pronounced, let there be light, we still have a time in which there's still darkness, there's still night, but it's about to end. Because when God speaks, when it says, and God said, it has a sense of finality. He will end darkness. He will put an end to it. So from this little expression, and God said, from this introductory quote, this formula, we get so much. It is centered in God. It has an emotional surge, and it has a sense of finality. He's addressing this issue. Period. Maybe it's just the nerd in me, but to me this is super exciting. It is the Word of God. We're digging into the very foundations of the Word. So verse 6, then God said, and he's going to issue 2 commands here. Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. I want you to notice this. God is giving commands throughout this chapter, many, many of them. But they're not technically commands. And let me tell you why. When you issue a command, you're speaking to a person in second person. You do this. That's not what we see in Genesis 1. He didn't say, light, He didn't speak to the light. He spoke the light into existence. What's the difference? You see, in the ancient Near East, all of these things, the light and the darkness, the sea, the abyss, they were all personified. They were beings. And they were creators. They were the gods that fought among them and created this world. And the Bible says, no, they're not. They are things. They're not beings. They're not spirits. They're not gods. They are nothing. They're inanimate objects. The light, the expanse. That's why he's not speaking to them. He's speaking them into existence. Huge difference. We're going to see that when we address the Egyptian myths and the Babylonian myths and the Canaanite myths. So he issued these commands. When you have a command in third person like that, it's called a jussive. I'm sorry, I didn't invent these words. It's called a jussive. So pardon me. Don't shoot the messenger. We use this actually. For instance, we say, hey, let's go. You know what that is? It's a command with you included in it. It's a first person command. You're commanding yourself along with somebody else, let's go. Or, you may see this in the Bible. For instance, Joseph addressing Pharaoh. He's telling him the dream. Pharaoh, this is the dream that you had. This is what it means. And then he's going to tell Pharaoh, listen, find a man. Find a wise man. Put him on top of, all your cattle and all your fields. Collect the grain. That's not how Joseph speaks. Because that's not how you speak to a king. Unless you want to lose your head. He speaks like this. He says, let Pharaoh find a wise man and let Pharaoh put him over all his fields and all his cattle. And let the king, do this. You don't address the king directly. You address him in third person. You're talking to him, but you address him in third person. Let the king, do this. It's a little bit of what God does here. Not that these things, are superior to him, but he's just not addressing them. He's not giving them the pleasure of the other nations thinking that the sun and the moon and the stars and the expanse and the light, all of these things are beings comparable to him. They're not. They are being demoted to simple creations, inanimate objects. And then we see the typical template of this story. Verse 6 again. God said, he issues the commands, let there be an expanse, let us separate the waters from the waters. Verse 7, and God made the expanse, so that's the execution, and separated the waters which were below the expanse, which were above the expanse, from the waters which were above the expanse. And it was so. It was done. That's the execution summary. And then comes the naming. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning, a second day. That's the Vayehi plus temporal, which means we have a break. We have a break. So we have the command, the execution, the naming. There's one missing, though. Can you guess which one it is? The evaluation. We didn't have an evaluation in day 2. It didn't say, and God saw that it was good. Really, Joey? I'm hungry, man. I just want to go to lunch, man. You keep bringing this stuff. I'm tired of thinking. Now I need to think of what the text doesn't say. I had enough with what the text says. Now I need to think what it doesn't say. I'm sorry. It does not give you an evaluation formula. It doesn't say, and God said. And God saw that it was good. Not in day 2. Why? Why? In day 2, he separated the waters from the water. He put some of the water on top, but the earth was still covered with water. What are we talking about in this chapter? We're talking about the earth. That's what we saw in verse 2. And the earth was formless and void. That's the subject in the whole chapter. In day 2, we did not advance in terms of making the earth good. So on day 2, there's no statement that it was good. Who knew? Now I got to think of what the Bible doesn't say. But then it highlights what it says in day 3. So let's go quickly through day 3, and then I'll let you go to lunch. Of course, you can get up and go at any time. Verse 9. And God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. That's the execution of the command. Here comes the naming. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. There's the evaluation. God saw that it was good. You heard me talk about good over and over and over again. For 7 years, I've been talking about what good means. Good is that which makes the land fruitful. Good is that which makes you and me fruitful. So the category of good is much bigger than moral or immoral. Should I go see that movie? No, it has immoral stuff in it. Should I see this other movie? Well, let me see. It doesn't have any moral stuff in it, but I don't know. I just don't think it's good for you. The category of good is greater than moral or immoral. Does it make you fruitful? Does it make you fruitful? If the answer is no, it's not good. Even if it doesn't have any immoral stuff in it. So, verse 10. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, wait, we didn't finish here. Every time that we go through it, it finishes, it says, and there was morning and there was evening, day 3. Oh, because day 3 has 2 acts of creation. 2 acts of creation. So we're not done. We're halfway in day 3. Verse 11, then God said, same type of implications. Centered in God, there's an emotional surge, and there is a finality to this. Let the earth sprout vegetation. These are the commands. Plant yielding seed, fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind, with seed in them on the earth. And it was so. That's the execution statement. It was carried out. But then the execution gets more specific. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit, with seed in them after their kind. Here comes the evaluation. And God saw that it was good. Then we have the break. There was evening and there was morning, a third day. We're going to stop right here, but I'm going to mention one thing super important as we close. Verse 12. And the earth brought forth vegetation. This phrase, brought forth, same word for the Exodus. Right? We talked about this. And the Torah will go forth from Zion, like in an Exodus. Well, here is use of the vegetation. The earth brought forth vegetation. The earth is trying to go through this process, and then finally it comes out, the vegetation. This is the process that God has brought this whole thing. It started full of water, covered with darkness. God is bringing the vegetation of the earth through an Exodus experience. He is dealing with the darkness, with the oppressive pharaohs. He's dealing with the waters. Now, finally, we have dry land. And then he commands, and the vegetation comes forth in resurrection, in Exodus. There is the Exodus right here in Genesis 1. God has chosen this word intentionally. When Israel read this word, they knew how he was comparing the two, comparing creation to the Exodus, bringing creation through a process of defeating the oppressors to bring freedom. We've completed the cycle of the first 3 days, and they are going to mirror the cycles of the last 3 days. We are at a high point here with this reference to the Exodus, and we're going to pick it up again and bring it back. That's part of the symmetry of chapter 1 of Genesis. And as we get to that second act in day 6, that's going to be our climax. Because then God would have defeated all of these elements. So far, he has formed the land that was formless, but it is still empty. We're only halfway through. He's going to fill it. And we're going to see that in days 4, 5, and 6. He will fill the skies, he will fill the seas, and then he will fill the dry ground. And then we will see not only the conclusion, but the consequence. And here's my proposal and my thesis. That the theologically significant statement in a story happens in this section that I'm calling the consequence. So we have the introduction, the conflict, the climax. We're going to get to the conclusion, but the important theological statement is going to be in the consequence. That's what we're going to discover next week. What is in this section of the story, in the consequence of the story, that is so important? What is the main thing that Genesis 1 is trying to tell us about? What is the main thing? Because that is going to carry for the rest of Genesis, for the rest of the Torah, for the rest of the Bible, for the rest of history. That's how important it is. And it is hidden right there. And the only way to really harvest it is by understanding it through the eyes of a story, through these 5 elements of the story, knowing that the element of consequence is what yields to us the main theological proposition of this passage. Is that good? We're going to go a little deeper. We're going to go a little deeper. So come prepared. Bring a snack. Take a little nap. Let's pray.